In the crisp October air of 1929, the canyons of Lower Manhattan echoed with a sound that had defined the decade. The relentless clatter of ticker tapes spitting out fortunes in real time. The urgent shouts of brokers sealing deals that turned clerks into millionaires overnight. The low murmur of crowds pressing against the marble facade of the New York Stock Exchange, as if proximity alone could guarantee wealth. On Black Thursday the 24th, the rhythm fractured. Sell orders cascaded like a waterfall. Prices plunged in minutes, and the once confident traders watched their paper empires evaporate under the harsh glow of electric lights that suddenly felt cold and merciless. Outside on the pavement, hundreds stood in stunned clusters, their breath visible in the autumn chill, faces drained of color, as whispered rumors of ruin spread faster than any headline. Inside the exchange, the floor was a sea of discarded tickets and crumpled telegrams, the air heavy with the acrid scent of fear and cigar smoke. Billions in value disappeared in hours, yet the deeper wound was invisible, a quiet severing of trust in the very idea that money could hold meaning, when the system that created it began to unravel. The collapse did not begin with chaos. It began quietly in the overleveraged dreams of a nation convinced that the Roaring Twenties would never end. But no one understood what was coming next, as the first cracks in the economics foundation widened into fissures that would swallow an entire era. To comprehend the scale of what was unfolding, one must return to the world that had been forged in the aftermath of the Great War. The guns of 1918 fell silent, leaving Europe exhausted and indebted, while the United States emerged as the unchallenged workshop of the planet. American factories that once produced shells and tanks now turned out automobiles, radios, and refrigerators at speeds once unimaginable, and the gold that flowed in from war debts and reparations financed a lending boom that circled the globe. Cities rose with breathtaking speed. Chicago's loop pulsed with the neon promise of progress. Detroit's assembly lines hummed day and night, and the new middle class filled department stores with goods once reserved for the elite. Radio waves carried jazz and baseball scores into living rooms across the continent, binding a vast nation in shared optimism. Yet this prosperity rested on a delicate lattice of international finance and domestic credit that few paused to examine. The victors of Versailles owed America billions. Germany struggled under reparations, and American banks recycled those payments into new loans that kept the wheels spinning. It was a system of elegant interdependence that masked its own fragility. A golden age built on the assumption that growth itself was eternal. By the time the invisible strains became audible, the momentum was already too great to reverse, and the stage had been set for a rupture that would test the limits of human endurance. Daily life before the collapse shimmered with a confidence that felt almost tangible. Families gathered around mahogany radios to hear Amos and Andy, or the latest hit from Duke Ellington, while young women in knee-length dresses danced the Charleston under crystal chandeliers in speakeasies that defied prohibition with defiant laughter. Model T Fords rolled off assembly lines and onto newly paved highways, carrying salesmen and vacationers alike toward horizons that seemed limitless. In the suburbs of Cleveland and Los Angeles, modest homes filled with electric toasters and vacuum cleaners symbolized a rising standard of living that reached even the working class. Children played stickball in alleyways while their fathers returned from factories with steady paychecks and the promise of installment plans that made refrigerators and phonographs suddenly affordable. The air in summer evenings carried the scent of fresh-cut grass and backyard barbecues, the sound of screen doors slamming as neighbors shared gossip about the latest stock tips. No one locked their doors against tomorrow, because tomorrow always paid more than today. The stock ticker became a national heartbeat, its rising numbers a lullaby that soothed worries and encouraged risk. Yet beneath the surface of this vibrant routine lay threads of quiet unease that only the most perceptive could detect. Threads that would soon pull the entire tapestry apart when the music finally stopped. The economic boom of the 1920s masked its own contradictions with the brilliance of a magician's trick. Corporations posted record profits while wages lagged behind productivity, and the top 1% captured a disproportionate share of the nation's wealth. Farmers in the Midwest and South watched crop prices tumble after wartime demand evaporated, yet they continued to plant more in a desperate bid to stay afloat, piling debt upon debt. Installment buying let consumers purchase on credit what they could not yet afford, creating an illusion of widespread prosperity that depended on perpetual expansion. Banks lent freely against stocks bought on margin, $10 of borrowed money for every dollar of real capital, inflating a bubble whose surface gleamed like polished marble. In boardrooms and country clubs, executives toasted the future with champagne, while factory foremen quietly noted the slowing orders that never quite reached the newspapers. The Federal Reserve kept interest rates low to encourage investment, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge that the system had grown dangerously unbalanced. Speculators from every walk of life crowded into brokerage offices, dreaming of overnight riches, while the underlying economy began to strain under the weight of overproduction and underconsumption. The collapse did not announce itself with trumpets, it whispered through balance sheets and warehouse inventories, invisible warning signs that most chose to ignore because the party still felt too good to end. By the late summer of 1929, the first tremors rippled through the market in ways that should have alarmed those paying attention. Stock prices reached dizzying heights, detached from the actual earnings of the companies they represented, and seasoned investors began to sense an unnatural fragility in the daily climb. Agricultural regions, already staggered by low commodity prices, saw bank foreclosures rise, yet the urban centers continued their feverish speculation as if the heartland's troubles belonged to another country. International loans started to falter as European economies struggled to repay what they owed America, creating a tightening spiral of credit that crossed oceans in telegraph wires. In Washington, policymakers spoke of continued prosperity, while quietly noting the rising inventories of unsold goods gathering dust in warehouses from Pittsburgh to San Francisco. The air in trading rooms grew thicker with nervous energy, laughter a little too loud, handshakes a little too firm. Still, the majority clung to the belief that any dip was merely temporary, a healthy correction in an otherwise unstoppable ascent. The warning signs remained invisible to those who refused to see them, buried beneath the roar of optimism and the clink of glasses raised to future gains. By the time the signs became clear, it was already too late for the machinery of confidence to be slowed. Key decisions made in the preceding years now revealed their terrible weight. The Federal Reserve's earlier policy of easy money had encouraged the very speculation that now threatened to undo the system, while its late attempts to tighten credit only accelerated the panic when it finally arrived. Political leaders in both parties had championed laissez-faire economics, convinced that markets corrected themselves without government interference, a philosophy that left no safety net when the fall began. Corporate executives had distributed dividends generously while resisting wage increases, widening the gap between production and purchasing power. Banks had loaned against inflated stock collateral with reckless abandon, believing the upward trajectory would never break. International agreements on war debts and reparations had created a fragile web of obligations that snapped under the slightest pressure. Each choice, rational in its moment, had compounded into a collective vulnerability that no single leader or institution could now contain. The pressure mounted like steam in a sealed boiler, and the decisions that once seemed prudent now appeared as fatal miscalculations. The moment the system began to fail was not marked by a single decree, but by the slow realization that the rules everyone had trusted no longer applied. The crash itself unfolded with a speed that stunned even the most hardened observers. On Black Tuesday, the 29th of October, the exchange recorded the heaviest trading volume in its history, as 16 million shares changed hands in a frenzy of liquidation. Prices collapsed in a vertical plunge that erased $25 billion in market value within days, an amount greater than the entire cost of the Great War. Telegraph wires hummed with margin calls that could not be met, forcing brokers to sell holdings at any price. Inside the exchange, the floor became a battlefield of shouted orders and frantic gestures, the usual order replaced by raw desperation. Outside, crowds pressed against police barricades, their silence broken only by occasional sobs or angry murmurs. In the weeks that followed, the panic spread beyond Wall Street as banks called in loans that borrowers could not repay. The machinery of finance that had seemed invincible now seized and sputtered, credit dried up, and the invisible architecture supporting everyday commerce began to crumble. Factories cut shifts, merchants canceled orders, and the first ripples of unemployment spread outward like concentric waves from a stone dropped into still water. As winter tightened its grip in 1930, the first visible cracks in daily life appeared in the form of shuttered factories and lengthening breadlines. Men who had once punched time clocks with steady pride now stood in silent queues outside soup kitchens, their overcoats threadbare, their eyes fixed on the pavement to avoid the shame of recognition. Banks that had survived the initial crash began to fail by the hundreds, as panicked depositors demanded their savings in cash that simply no longer existed. The silence inside those marble lobbies was profound, broken only by the shuffle of feet and the occasional muffled cry when a teller's window closed for good. In the industrial cities of the Northeast and Midwest, the smokestacks that once painted the sky gray now stood cold and skeletal against the horizon, their furnaces dark for the first time in a generation. Families gathered around kitchen tables under dim electric bulbs, counting pennies and rationing coal, the radio now carrying news of further declines rather than jazz orchestras. The human consequences of the financial rupture were no longer abstract. They were measured in missed rent payments, repossessed furniture, and the slow erosion of hope that settled over neighborhoods like a fine layer of dust. The social fabric began to fray in ways both intimate and public. Evictions became routine spectacles on city streets, families watching their belongings stacked on sidewalks while neighbors averted their eyes in helpless sympathy. Shantytowns sprang up on the edges of parks and riverbanks, makeshift shelters of scrap wood and corrugated tin christened Hoovervilles in bitter tribute to the president who insisted recovery was just around the corner. Children went to school with empty stomachs, their shoes patched with cardboard, while teachers quietly shared their own lunches. In the rural South and Midwest, tenant farmers watched landlords seize their tools and mules, forcing entire communities into wandering in search of day labor that rarely materialized. The psychological toll was invisible, yet profound, measured in sleepless nights, quiet arguments behind closed doors, and the growing number of men who simply disappeared rather than face the humiliation of joblessness. Fear became a constant companion, a low hum beneath every conversation, every meal, every attempt to maintain the routines that once defined normal life. The collapse had moved from balance sheets to backyards, and the human cost was only beginning to reveal itself in full. Nowhere was the environmental dimension of the breakdown more devastating than in the southern Great Plains, where years of overplowing and drought transformed fertile wheat fields into a barren wasteland known as the Dust Bowl. Black blizzards rolled across Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas, walls of dirt 50 feet high that blotted out the sun and buried farmhouses in choking silt. Families tied handkerchiefs over their faces and huddled in root cellars while the wind howled like a living thing, carrying away topsoil that had taken centuries to form. Livestock suffocated in the fields, their lungs coated in fine dust, and children developed dust pneumonia that filled hospital wards with small, wheezing bodies. The silence after each storm was eerie, broken only by the creak of windmill blades turning uselessly above dry wells. Entire counties emptied as tractors rusted in place, and farmhouses stood abandoned, with doors swinging open to the relentless wind. The Dust Bowl was not merely a natural disaster. It was the visible scar of an economic system that had pushed the land beyond its limits in pursuit of short-term profit, compounding the human misery already spreading from the cities. The Great Migration that followed carved new scars across the American landscape. Families from the Dust Bowl states loaded battered Model A Fords with whatever they could carry, and joined the steady stream of Okies heading west along Route 66 toward the promised orchards of California. Highways became rivers of desperation, cars overheating under the desert sun, children peering from rear windows at the receding horizon of home. In migrant camps along the road, families shared stories around campfires, their faces illuminated by flickering flames that could not hide the hollow look in their eyes. Upon reaching the Promised Land, they found not opportunity, but hostility. Armed guards at state borders, and growers who paid wages too low to feed a family. Tent cities sprang up in the shadows of citrus groves, the air thick with the scent of oranges that the pickers themselves could not afford to eat. The journey west tested every bond of marriage and parenthood, some families fracturing under the strain, while others clung together with a fierce, quiet determination. The roads of the 1930s became arteries, carrying the lifeblood of a nation in flight from its own collapse. In the cities, the breakdown of social order took forms both organized and chaotic. Unemployed men gathered in parks and under bridges, trading rumors of government relief that rarely arrived, their conversations punctuated by the occasional cough of tuberculosis that now spread unchecked through crowded tenements. Protests erupted outside factories and relief offices, voices hoarse from shouting slogans that demanded work or bread. Some turned to petty crime or begging, their pride eroded by months of fruitless searches for employment that no longer existed. Suicide rates climbed as the weight of failure became unbearable. Quiet acts of despair that newspapers sometimes noted in small type on back pages. Yet amid the hardship, pockets of resilience endured. Churches opened their doors to the homeless. Neighbors shared the last cup of flour, and children invented games with whatever scraps they could find. The human spirit did not break cleanly. It bent and adapted in ways that were both heartbreaking and defiant, revealing the depth of endurance required when money itself had lost all meaning, and survival became the only currency that mattered. The political landscape shifted dramatically as the Depression deepened into its fourth year. In the election of 1932, Franklin Delano Roosevelt swept into office promising a New Deal for the American people, a phrase that resonated like a lifeline thrown to a drowning nation. His inaugural address in March 1933 carried a calm authority that cut through the national despair, declaring that the only thing to fear was fear itself. Within days, he closed the banks for a federal inspection, restoring a fragile confidence when they reopened under new safeguards. The 100 days that followed produced an avalanche of legislation, creating the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, and the Tennessee Valley Authority, programs that put millions back to work and began to tame the chaos of unchecked markets. The Glass-Steagall Act separated commercial and investment banking, while the Securities and Exchange Commission brought oversight to the once wild stock exchange. These measures did not end the Depression overnight, but they reshaped the relationship between citizen and government, introducing the idea that the state had a responsibility to protect its people from the worst excesses of economic collapse. The long-term historical impact would echo far beyond the 1930s, laying the foundations for modern social safety nets and regulatory frameworks that still define economic life today. Globally, the Depression accelerated forces already simmering beneath the surface of the post-war order. In Germany, the Weimar Republic staggered under hyperinflation and mass unemployment, creating fertile ground for extremist movements that promised order and revenge. Britain and France tightened imperial controls in a desperate bid to protect their own economies, while Japan turned toward militarism and resource conquest in Asia. International trade contracted sharply as nations raised tariffs in a spiral of retaliation that strangled the very commerce they hoped to save. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff of 1930 in the United States had already signaled the retreat into economic nationalism, a policy whose consequences rippled outward like cracks in ice. What began as a financial crisis in New York had become a worldwide contagion, toppling governments and redrawing alliances in ways that would ultimately lead to another global conflict. The interconnectedness that had fueled the 1920s boom now amplified the 1930s bust, proving that no nation could insulate itself from the economic weather of its neighbors. The collapse had reshaped not only American society, but the entire architecture of 20th century civilization. As the decade drew toward its close, and the shadows of another world war lengthened across Europe, the Great Depression left behind a transformed landscape, where the meaning of money had been permanently altered in the collective memory. Entire generations learned that savings could vanish overnight, that banks were not fortresses, and that prosperity could evaporate when trust in the system dissolved. The photographs of breadlines and dust storms, the songs of Woody Guthrie, and the novels of John Steinbeck preserved the raw human texture of those years, ensuring that the rupture would never be reduced to mere statistics. Yet the most haunting legacy was the quiet realization that the intricate machinery of modern economies rested on nothing more solid than shared belief, a belief that could fracture under pressure and leave millions adrift in the ruins. The collapse had exposed the thin line between order and chaos, between abundance and want, and though recovery eventually came, it arrived bearing scars that would influence policy and culture for generations. In the end, the Great Depression did not simply end. It lingered like a ghost in the corridors of power and the quiet anxieties of ordinary people. A reminder that the systems we build to master uncertainty are themselves the most uncertain of all. The money may have regained its numbers, but the deeper meaning it once held, the unquestioned promise of permanence, had been lost forever in the long, hard years when the world learned what happens when faith in the future itself begins to fail.